On a muggy morning when March had just begun in 1943, Commander Hideo Kuboki found himself stationed on the command deck of the destroyer Arashio, his eyes methodically sweeping across the misty waters of the Bismarck Sea. The air hung heavy with moisture as the early light struggled to penetrate the morning haze. Down on the deck below, his crew worked with desperate urgency, their exhausted bodies straining as they hauled waterlogged survivors from the ocean's surface. These were the men from Kyokusei Maru, a transport vessel that had met its fate beneath the waves just 24 hours earlier. The convoy known as Operation 81 had set out with a critical mission to deliver much-needed reinforcement troops to Lae in New Guinea, and already they had suffered their first casualty at the hands of American B-17 bombers. Yet Kuboki, along with his fellow commanding officers, maintained a cautiously optimistic outlook. The worst appeared to be behind them now. Their destination lay just hours away, and the promise of fighter protection from Lae seemed to guarantee their safe passage through these remaining nautical miles. Then the moment arrived that would determine the fate of thousands of men. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, a lookout's urgent cry pierced through the tropical air with a single devastating word that announced incoming aircraft. What materialized from the southwestern sky bore no resemblance to any assault Kuboki had witnessed throughout his extensive naval career. These were not the high-flying B-17 fortresses they had confronted the previous day, those lumbering giants that released their payloads from altitudes of 5,000 feet where anti-aircraft batteries could at least make attempts to engage them. The aircraft approaching now represented something entirely different: B-25. Mitchell bombers accompanied by Australian Beaufighters, screaming in at such minimal altitude that their spinning propellers seemed to whip the very spray from the ocean's surface. Their speed was tremendous, and they advanced in perfect coordination at wave-top level, executing an attack pattern that would fundamentally revolutionize the conduct of naval combat throughout the Pacific theater. In the span of mere heartbeats, in the time required for a skip bomb equipped with its 5-second delayed fuse to bounce and skip across the water's surface, Kuboki's entire reality would shatter into pandemonium. His vessel would sustain crippling damage, the steering mechanism obliterated, causing the Arashio to spiral out of control and smash directly into the transport Nojima Maru in a catastrophic collision. Within a quarter of an hour, the entire convoy would cease to exist as a functioning military force. 7 transport vessels carrying nearly 7,000 desperately needed soldiers would be consumed by flames or slipping beneath the waves. 4 of the 8 destroyer escorts would be utterly destroyed or damaged beyond any hope of survival. This moment represented far more than simply another convoy coming under attack. This marked the precise instant when skip bombing, a revolutionary tactical innovation developed behind closed doors by American military minds, would demonstrate conclusively that surface naval vessels could no longer operate with any measure of safety within striking distance of land-based air forces. 2 months prior to this devastating assault that would send shockwaves through the Imperial Japanese Navy, in January of 1943, Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura found himself confronting an increasingly dire situation from his headquarters position at Rabaul on New Britain. The Allied military had just succeeded in capturing Buna along the New Guinea coastline, following months of savage jungle warfare, and now their forces posed a direct threat to the crucial Japanese military installations at Lae and Salamaua. These bases represented far more than simple military outposts. They formed the absolute cornerstone of Japan's comprehensive defensive architecture throughout the Southwest Pacific region, serving as protective barriers for the approaches to Rabaul itself, that fortress the Allies had nicknamed the Gibraltar of the Pacific, where close to 100,000 Japanese troops maintained their positions. Should Lae fall into enemy hands, the Allies would gain an unobstructed pathway to push northward along the New Guinea coast, ultimately threatening the Philippines and potentially even the Japanese home islands themselves. The cold calculations of warfare in this theatre presented brutal and inescapable mathematics. Every individual soldier, every grain of rice, every round of ammunition had to travel by sea transport from Rabaul, crossing the treacherous expanses of the Solomon and Bismarck Seas. The distance measured only 500 miles, yet it might as well have spanned 5,000, given the exponentially growing capabilities of Allied air power, which operated from established bases at Port Moresby and Milne Bay. Previous attempts to run convoys through these waters had already met with decidedly mixed outcomes. On January 7th, a convoy transporting the 102nd Infantry Regiment under the command of Major General Toru Okabe had managed to reach Leh, though not without paying a steep price in blood and materiel. The transport ship Nichiryu Maru had been sent to the bottom by an Australian Catalina flying boat, taking with it the entirety of Okabe's medical supplies, along with 361 soldiers. Another transport, the Miyoko Maru, sustained such severe damage that the only option remaining was to deliberately beach the vessel. The expense of reinforcing New Guinea positions was climbing to unsustainable levels. General Imamura understood with crystalline clarity that decisive action could not be postponed. Intelligence reports painted an unmistakable picture of Allied preparations for a massive offensive operation. He required at minimum a full division's worth of reinforcements at Leh if there existed any reasonable hope of maintaining the position. Following intense discussions with his staff officers and naval commanders, a plan began to take shape. Operation 81 would be a major convoy undertaking that aimed to deliver 6,900 fresh troops from the 51st Division directly to Leh in a single concentrated effort. The inherent dangers were openly acknowledged by all parties involved. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, the brilliant tactical mind behind the Pearl Harbor attack, issued a stark warning that casualties might well exceed 50%. However, the alternative strategy of landing the troops further up the coastline and forcing them to march through hostile jungle terrain would almost certainly result in even more grievous losses from tropical diseases, starvation, and constant Allied air harassment. The decision crystallized. The convoy would set sail regardless of the risks. The officer selected to command this absolutely critical operation was Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, who held command of the 3rd Destroyer Squadron. At 54 years of age, Kimura stood among the Imperial Navy's most seasoned destroyer commanders. He had proven himself a veteran of innumerable nocturnal engagements in the Solomon Islands, where Japanese destroyers had consistently demonstrated their superiority time and time again against Allied naval forces. His task force for Operation 81 commanded respect through its composition alone. 8 of the Imperial Navy's finest destroyers, each one a battle-tested veteran of the Guadalcanal campaign, would make up his escort force. The Shirayuki would serve as the flagship, bearing Kimura's command pennant. Accompanying her would be Asashio, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Shikinami, Uranami, and another Asashio. These were names that inspired genuine fear among Allied sailors who had faced them during night surface actions. Yet this operation bore no resemblance to the lightning-fast destroyer runs that Kimura had perfected throughout the Solomon Islands campaign, those high-speed supply missions the Americans had dubbed the Tokyo Express. This time around, his swift destroyers would be forced to shepherd 8 plodding, vulnerable transport ships loaded to capacity with soldiers and supplies. The convoy's maximum sustainable speed would barely exceed 7 knots, scarcely faster than a human being could jog. For Kimura, whose tactical expertise had been honed while slashing through enemy-controlled waters at 30 knots, this crawling pace must have felt comparable to sailing with a sea anchor deployed. Every hour spent at sea multiplied the probability of detection. Every mile travelled during daylight hours invited air attack from above. Meanwhile, 500 miles distant at Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, an entirely different type of military intellect was grappling with the strategic challenges of the Pacific campaign. Lieutenant General George Kenny, commanding the Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, had recognized that should he prove unable to interdict Japanese convoys from reinforcing their positions, General MacArthur's planned offensive advance up the New Guinea coast would inevitably deteriorate into a bloody war of attrition. Yet Kenny represented anything but a conventional military thinker. Prior to the outbreak of war, he had established something of a maverick reputation, frequently finding himself in professional difficulty for advancing radical concepts that challenged established orthodoxy. Back in 1928, during his tenure as an instructor at the Air Corps Tactical School, he had theorized about a technique he termed skip bombing, which involved dropping explosive ordnance from extremely low altitude in such a manner that the bombs would skip across water surfaces like flat stones before detonating against a ship's hull. The concept had been summarily dismissed as excessively dangerous and thoroughly impractical. Now, however, with American forces desperately searching for methods to stop Japanese shipping, Kenny determined that the time had arrived to transform theoretical concept into operational reality. The development of skip bombing represented far more than merely a technical challenge. It constituted a genuine revolution in aerial warfare methodology that demanded a complete rethinking of every aspect of how bomber aircraft engaged surface vessels. Major William Benn, commanding officer of the 63rd Bombardment Squadron, became Kenny's primary test pilot for perfecting the technique. Through extensive trial and error experimentation, they discovered that optimal approach parameters required maintaining an altitude of just 200 to 250 feet, while flying at speeds between 200 and 250 miles per hour. The bomb had to be released at a distance of 300 to 600 yards from the target vessel, with the munition equipped with a 4 to 5 second delay fuse. Too high an approach, and the bomb would fail to skip properly across the water. Too low, and the attacking aircraft risked being destroyed by the blast from its own weapon or by flying debris from the target vessel. The operational margin for error was effectively zero. Kenny recognized, however, that skip bombing alone would prove insufficient for success. The bombers required some method to suppress the intense anti-aircraft fire they would inevitably face during their low-level attack runs. This realization brought another military innovator into the developing story. Major Paul Irvin Gunn, known universally as Pappy, was a 43-year-old former Navy pilot who had evolved into Kenny's go-to specialist for unconventional solutions. Gunn had already achieved something approaching legendary status throughout the Southwest Pacific Theater. When hostilities commenced, he had been working as a civilian airline pilot in the Philippines. His family had been captured by Japanese forces and subsequently interned at Santo Tomas prison camp in Manila, a personal tragedy that had instilled in him an all-consuming desire for vengeance against the Japanese military machine. Gunn's mechanical genius became the crucial element in making skip bombing operationally survivable. Taking a standard B-25 Mitchell bomber as his starting point, he stripped out the bombardier's compartment located in the aircraft's nose section and replaced it with 4 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. His modifications did not stop there. He added 2 additional guns mounted on each side of the fuselage and another 4 underneath the aircraft, effectively creating a flying gunship platform with devastating forward-directed firepower. When Kenny first laid eyes on Gunn's modified B-25, which had been nicknamed Pappy's Folly, he immediately grasped its tactical potential. "Strip everything out of the nose section and pack it full of 50-caliber guns," he instructed Gunn. "Strap additional weapons on the sides. Provide me with maximum possible forward firepower." The objective was creating a skip bomber capable of overwhelming the deck defences of a Japanese destroyer through sheer volume of fire. Throughout February 1943, the modified bombers engaged in relentless practice sessions against the wreck of the SS Pruth, a passenger vessel that had run aground off Port Moresby back in 1923. Day after day, the B-25s thundered in at mast height, their guns blazing continuously, bombs skipping across the water to slam into the rusted hulk. The accuracy proved remarkable, far superior to anything achievable through high-level bombing techniques. Practicing against a stationary wreck represented one challenge, however. Attacking a convoy of operational warships manned by trained anti-aircraft crews and protected by fighter cover constituted something entirely different in terms of difficulty and danger. The Australian contribution to this revolutionary tactical development deserves full recognition. No. 30 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force, equipped with Bristol Beaufighter aircraft, had been independently developing their own low-level attack methodologies. The Beaufighter, armed with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, possessed ideal characteristics for suppressing ship defensive positions. Group Captain Bill Garing, an RAAF officer serving on Kenny's staff who brought extensive experience in anti-shipping operations from the European theatre, proposed a coordinated attack plan. Beaufighters would strike first at mast height, suppressing anti-aircraft positions through concentrated cannon and machine gun fire, followed immediately by the skip-bombing B-25s. High-level B-17s would simultaneously attack from above, dividing the enemy's defensive fire and generating maximum confusion among the convoy vessels. On February 14th, reconnaissance photographs of Rabaul harbour triggered alarm throughout Allied headquarters. The imagery revealed 79 vessels in port, including 45 merchant ships and 6 large transport vessels. The conclusion seemed inescapable that a major convoy operation was imminent. 2 days later, Ultra-Intelligence, the absolutely top-secret Allied capability to decrypt and read Japanese coded communications, provided the crucial operational details. Naval codebreakers working in Melbourne and Washington had successfully decrypted Japanese messages revealing that a convoy would depart Rabaul on February 28th, with Leh as its destination, carrying substantial reinforcements from the 51st Division. The intercepted messages even specified the convoy's planned route and estimated arrival date of March 5th. Kenny immediately recognized this as precisely the opportunity for which he had been waiting, the chance to test his new tactical concepts in a decisive engagement. He summoned his key commanders to Port Moresby for final planning coordination. Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead, serving as Kenny's deputy and commanding the advance echelon forces in New Guinea, would assume responsibility for coordinating the attack. The operational plan called for maximum effort deployment from every available aircraft. 90 heavy bombers consisting of B-17 and B-24s, 41 medium bombers in the form of B-25s, 34 light bombers designated as A-20 Havocs, and 54 fighter aircraft including P-38 Lightnings and P-40 Warhawks would participate. In total, 219 aircraft would be thrown against the convoy, representing the largest coordinated airstrike yet attempted anywhere in the southwest Pacific region. The Allied pilots experienced a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Skip bombing remained an experimental technique, and many had never attempted it under actual combat conditions. Lieutenant Charles Howe from the 3rd Attack Group voiced the concern felt by many participants when he observed that approaching at such low altitude would make them sitting ducks, and that a single lucky hit from a destroyer's guns would end their participation permanently. Major Ed Larner, who would lead the skip-bombing assault, projected absolute confidence. The training had been thorough, he insisted. Trust the plan completely. Execute the approach fast, strike hard, and exit rapidly. The Beaufighters would clear the path forward. Back at Rabaul, the Japanese convoy prepared for departure with meticulous attention to detail. Each transport ship underwent combat loading procedures, meaning equipment and supplies were packed in reverse order of anticipated need, permitting the fastest possible unloading process at Leh. The 5,954 soldiers belonging to the 51st Division's 115th Regiment boarded their assigned transport vessels. The ships included Ayo Maru, Kembu Maru, Nojima Maru, Oigawa Maru, Shinai Maru, Taime Maru, and Teiyo Maru. An 8th transport, Natsushima, carried aviation fuel and supplies desperately required by Japanese air units stationed at Leh. The destroyers themselves carried an additional 958 troops, packed into every conceivable available space aboard the warships. The human cargo included some of the most important Japanese army commanders operating in New Guinea. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, commander of the entire 18th Army, boarded the destroyer Tokitsukaze. Lieutenant General Hidemitsu Nakano, commanding the 51st Division, took passage aboard Yukikaze, along with his complete divisional staff. This concentration of senior leadership within a single convoy represented an unusual situation that spoke simultaneously to both Japanese confidence and desperation. Confidence that their destroyer escorts could adequately protect the convoy against enemy action. Desperation to transport these commanders to Leh, where they were urgently needed to stabilize the deteriorating tactical situation. Admiral Kimura's operational plan reflected hard-earned lessons from previous convoy operations. Rather than selecting the direct route across the Solomon Sea, which would expose the convoy to air attack for maximum duration, the convoy would follow a longer northern route. They would sail north from Rabaul, then turn west along the northern coastline of New Britain, utilizing the island's mountainous terrain to shield them from Allied radar detection and provide some measure of protection from air attacks approaching from southern directions. The final leg would constitute the most dangerous phase, turning south through the restricted waters of the Vitiaz Strait, followed by a dash along the Huon Gulf coast to reach Leh. The strait, measuring only 50 miles wide at its narrowest point, would funnel the convoy into a predictable path where vulnerability to air attack would reach maximum levels. To provide air cover protection, the Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces based at Rabaul promised 100 fighters maintaining rotating patrol stations over the convoy. This promise carried inherent problems, however. The distance from Rabaul to the Vitiaz Strait pushed the extreme operational range for Japanese fighter aircraft. They could remain on station for only brief periods before requiring return to base for refueling. Moreover, many Japanese pilots were physically exhausted from months of continuous combat operations, and their aircraft showed increasing wear with spare parts in critically short supply. The stark reality dictated that the convoy would possess effective air cover for only portions of its journey. On the evening of February 28, 1943, as tropical darkness descended over Simpson Harbour, the convoy initiated its departure sequence. One by one, the heavily laden transport vessels eased away from the wharves, their decks crowded with soldiers taking what many must have suspected would represent their final glimpse of Rabaul. The destroyers circled protectively, their crews manning battle stations despite operating in ostensibly friendly waters. Submarine attacks, even in such close proximity to base, were not unknown occurrences. Rear Admiral Kimura, standing on Shirayuki's bridge, observed his charges forming into two columns, with destroyers assuming stations on the flanks and forward of the formation. At precisely midnight, he ordered the convoy to proceed at 7 knots on course 350 degrees into the darkness of the Bismarck Sea. The initial day passed without significant incident. Weather conditions, frequently an adversary for sailors, became an unexpected ally as two tropical storm systems swept through the Solomon and Bismarck seas, bringing low cloud cover and rain squalls that concealed the convoy from Allied reconnaissance aircraft. The Japanese sailors and soldiers, many already suffering seasickness from the slow rolling motion of overloaded transports, nonetheless felt relief with each passing hour that brought them closer to their destination without detection. Rear Admiral Kimura understood, however, that such favourable conditions could not persist indefinitely. The storm systems were breaking up, and tomorrow would likely bring clear weather, and with it, American bombers. His concerns proved well-founded. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon on March 1st, as the convoy rounded Cape Gloucester at the western extremity of New Britain and turned southward toward the Vitiaz Strait, the cloud cover parted briefly. At that precise moment, a B-24 Liberator from the 91st Bombardment Group, piloted by Lieutenant Walter Higgins, happened to be passing overhead on a routine reconnaissance flight. Higgins could scarcely believe his fortune as he counted the ships below. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, positioned exactly where intelligence had predicted they would be. He immediately transmitted the contact report that would set in motion one of the most decisive air-sea battles of the entire Pacific War. At 5th Air Force Headquarters in Port Moresby, the atmosphere transformed instantly as Higgins' contact report arrived. General Kenny immediately ordered execution of the attack plan they had rehearsed so carefully. A problem existed, however. The convoy had been spotted earlier than anticipated, still positioned north of the Vitiaz Strait, where Japanese fighters from New Britain could more readily provide cover. Whitehead made a crucial tactical decision. The initial attack would employ conventional high-level bombing by B-17s, designed to inflict damage and slow the convoy's progress. The decisive skip-bombing attack would be delayed until the following day, when the convoy would be positioned in the more confined waters of the strait with reduced room for manoeuvring. On the morning of March 2nd, as the convoy continued its journey through increasingly clear weather conditions, the first American attack developed. 28 B-17 flying fortresses approached at 6,500 feet altitude, maintaining tight formations despite harassment from approximately 30 Japanese fighters that rose to intercept them. The Japanese transport captains, mostly civilian mariners pressed into military service, watched in horrified fascination as the massive four-engine bombers released their ordnance loads. Waterspouts erupted throughout the convoy area as most bombs missed their targets, but statistical probability worked in the Americans' favor. The transport Kyokusei Maru sustained a direct hit, broke in half, and disappeared beneath the waves within minutes. Another transport suffered damage and began falling behind the formation. Captain Sato Yasuo, commanding the destroyer Asashio and serving as commander of Destroyer Division 8, immediately moved to rescue survivors from the sinking Kyokusei Maru. His crew pulled nearly 700 soldiers and sailors from the oil-slicked waters, cramming them into every available space aboard the destroyer. This humanitarian action, while admirable from a moral standpoint, carried tactical consequences. Asashio now operated dangerously overloaded and less maneuverable, her fighting efficiency compromised by the mass of survivors crowding her decks. As night descended on March 2nd, Rear Admiral Kimura confronted a critical decision point. The convoy remained 12 hours from Leh, but they had already lost one transport and others had sustained damage. Should they continue at reduced speed with the damaged vessels, maintaining convoy integrity but remaining vulnerable for a longer duration? Or should the faster ships race ahead independently, splitting the convoy but delivering at least some troops to Leh quickly? Kimura chose to maintain convoy unity, a decision that would prove fatal. He signalled all ships to maintain formation and proceed together to Leh. Unknown to Kimura, his decision had been intercepted and decoded by Allied intelligence operations. Kenny and Whitehead knew precisely where the convoy would be positioned at dawn, its speed, its formation. The stage had been set for the revolutionary attack that would fundamentally alter naval warfare. That night, Allied strike crews received their final mission briefings. Tension pervaded the atmosphere as pilots and gunners performed repeated checks on their aircraft. Many composed letters to be sent home, understanding that tomorrow's low-level attack would place them within point-blank range of Japanese defensive guns. Dawn on March 3rd, 1943, broke clear and calm across the Bismarck Sea. Perfect flying weather conditions prevailed. The Japanese convoy, now positioned in the confined waters approaching the Huon Gulf, maintained its steady 7-knot advance toward Leh, now only hours distant. The surviving transport vessels had tightened their formation, with destroyers circling them protectively like sheepdogs guarding a flock. Rear Admiral Kimura had ordered all ships to maintain strict anti-aircraft discipline. No weapon was to open fire unless specifically ordered, conserving ammunition for the battle he knew was approaching. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the first wave of Allied aircraft materialized on the horizon, but this bore no resemblance to the high-level attack the Japanese anticipated. 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron, led by squadron leader Claude Ridley, approached at wave-top height, flying so low that their propeller wash left visible wakes on the calm sea surface. Behind them, visible as dark specks against the morning sky, came the B-25s of the 3rd Attack Group. On the bridge of destroyer Arashio, Commander Hideo Kuboki possessed mere seconds to process the visual information before him and formulate a response. His mind, disciplined through years of naval training and service, struggled to calculate multiple variables simultaneously. The speed and angle of approach of the incoming aircraft, the limitations of his anti-aircraft guns, which could not depress sufficiently low to engage targets at sea level, the necessity of maneuvering his ship while simultaneously maintaining protection for the transport vessels. These precious few seconds proved insufficient time for effective response. The Beaufighters were already upon his position, their 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns unleashing a devastating storm of fire that swept across Arashio's exposed decks. The Beaufighter attack proved devastating in its concentrated violence. Cannon shells detonated among the anti-aircraft gun crews, killing or wounding most personnel before they could bring their weapons to bear on the attackers. Machine gun fire raked across the bridge structure, shattering windows and cutting down officers and signalmen where they stood. Within seconds, Arashio's capacity to defend herself had been critically degraded. The Beaufighters represented merely the opening act, however. Immediately behind them came the B-25s, each aircraft carrying 2 500-pound bombs equipped with 5-second delay fuses, their nose-mounted guns already firing as they approached. Major Ed Lana led the B-25 attack formation, his modified bomber Betty's Dream approaching destroyer Shirayuki at 220 miles per hour, altitude 50 feet. Through his gun sight, he could observe Japanese sailors scrambling across the deck, some attempting to man defensive weapons, others diving for any available cover. At 300 yards distance, Lana released his bombs and executed a sharp pull-up maneuver, clearing the destroyer's mast by mere feet. Behind him, his bombs skipped across the water surface once, twice, then slammed into Shirayuki's hull just below the waterline. The effect proved catastrophic. The bombs penetrated the destroyer's relatively thin hull plating before exploding internally, their blast effect magnified by the confined spaces. Shirayuki's stern section was virtually blown completely off, her rear magazine detonating in a massive secondary explosion that sent debris and bodies flying hundreds of feet into the air. Within minutes, Rear Admiral Kimura's flagship was sinking rapidly, taking dozens of crew members with her. Kimura himself, wounded by shrapnel fragments, was pulled from the water by personnel from destroyer Shikinami. The attack developed with choreographed precision that would have been beautiful to observe if it were not so deadly in its execution. As the Beaufighters and B-25s swept through the convoy at sea level, high above them B-17s from the 43rd Bombardment Group released their ordnance loads from 7,000 feet altitude. The convoy's anti-aircraft gunners, those still alive and functional after the initial strafing runs, confronted an impossible tactical choice. Engage the low-level attackers who posed the most immediate threat, or attempt to disrupt the aim of the high-level bombers. Most chose the former option, filling the air with tracer rounds and shell bursts, but the B-25s were moving far too fast and flying far too low for effective engagement. Lieutenant Charles Howe, piloting his B-25 chatterbox, selected transport Teiyo Maru as his target. The vessel, loaded with over 1,000 soldiers, was attempting to turn away from the attack direction, her wake showing a desperate spiral pattern as her captain tried to present a smaller target profile. At skip bombing range and speed, such evasive maneuvers proved utterly futile. Howe's bombs skipped perfectly, one striking amidships, the other near the stern section. Teiyo Maru appeared to lift bodily from the water as the explosions tore through her hull structure, then settled rapidly, listing heavily to port. Within 5 minutes she had capsized completely, trapping hundreds of soldiers below decks. Destroyer Tokitsukaze, carrying Lieutenant General Adachi, became the target of 3 B-25s simultaneously. Her captain, Commander Masayoshi Motokura, attempted to shield nearby transport vessels by positioning his ship between them and the attacking aircraft, a courageous but ultimately futile gesture. Multiple bomb hits left Tokitsukaze dead in the water, her engine rooms flooded, fires raging amidships. General Adachi, remarkably emerging uninjured, was evacuated to destroyer Yukikaze. But 19 members of Tokitsukaze's crew were not so fortunate, killed instantly by the bombs and subsequent strafing runs. Commander Kuboki's Arashio, already severely damaged by the Beaufighter attack, now faced the B-25 assault. One bomb destroyed her steering gear completely, sending the destroyer into an uncontrolled turn that resulted in collision with transport Nojima Maru. The two vessels, locked together by the twisted metal of impact, became stationary targets for subsequent waves of attackers. Both ships were abandoned by their crews, personnel taking to the water as fires consumed the vessels. In the midst of this wholesale carnage, individual acts of heroism and horror played out across the battle area. On transport Kembu Maru, soldiers of the 51st Division, many experiencing combat for the first time, struggled desperately to launch life rafts as the ship listed increasingly to starboard. Their officers, swords drawn in accordance with tradition, attempted to maintain order and discipline, but panic was spreading rapidly as the reality of their situation became undeniable. They were positioned hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly shore, floating in shark-infested waters, with American aircraft methodically destroying any vessel that might attempt rescue operations. Destroyer Asashio, still crowded with survivors from yesterday's sinking of Kyokusei Maru, attempted to fight back against the overwhelming assault. Her captain, Captain Sato Yasuo, commander of Destroyer Division 8, ordered every available weapon system to fire at the attacking aircraft, creating a curtain of steel that momentarily caused some B-25s to alter their approach courses. The weight of numbers proved decisive, however. A B-17 operating high above, almost forgotten in the chaos of the low-level attacks, placed a 500-pound bomb directly on Asashio's forward deck. The explosion, combined with the hundreds of extra personnel crowding aboard, caused rapid catastrophic flooding. Captain Sato, adhering to the ancient code of Bushido, chose to remain aboard his ship as she went down. According to survivor accounts, his final words were an expression of exhaustion and a desire to rest peacefully in that place. Asashio sank with enormous loss of life. Not merely her regular crew, but many of the soldiers she had rescued just one day earlier. Captain Sato would receive posthumous promotion to Vice Admiral rank in recognition of his heroic actions. By 10:15 in the morning, a mere 15 minutes after the attack had commenced, the convoy had ceased to exist as an organized military force. 7 transport vessels were sinking, sunk, or burning uncontrollably, their oil and debris spreading across miles of ocean surface. Of the 8 destroyer escorts, 4 had been destroyed or sustained fatal damage. The surviving destroyers, consisting of Shikinami, Yukikaze, Uranami, and Asagamo, circled desperately through the expanding field of wreckage, attempting to pull survivors from the water. There were far too many men struggling in the water, and far too few ships remaining to conduct rescue operations effectively. The second wave of Allied aircraft arrived at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, finding a scene of utter devastation. Burning ships, expansive oil slicks, and floating debris covered square miles of ocean. The remaining Japanese destroyers, still attempting to recover survivors, were forced to abandon their humanitarian efforts and defend themselves against this fresh assault. Transport Ogawa Maru, somehow still afloat despite earlier damage, was finished off by additional skip-bombing attacks. Destroyer Asashio, already resting on the ocean floor with Captain Sato aboard, became a war grave as oil continued bubbling up from her wreckage to mark the spot. As darkness descended on March 3rd, the full magnitude of the disaster became apparent to all participants. Of 6,900 troops embarked at Rabaul with such care and hope, fewer than 1,000 would ultimately reach Leh. The destroyers that survived the onslaught, working through the night hours, managed to rescue approximately 2,700 men who would subsequently be returned to Rabaul. Nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were dead, killed in action or drowned in the Bismarck Sea. The carefully assembled reinforcement intended for New Guinea's defence had been annihilated in a single day's sustained air action. The aftermath of the battle proved as controversial as it was decisive in strategic terms. On March 4th, American PT boats and aircraft conducted patrols of the battle area, engaging anything that floated. The stated military justification centered on preventing Japanese troops from reaching shore and reinforcing Lae, but many Allied aircrew members were disturbed by what they perceived as unnecessary killing of helpless survivors. This moral complexity, the transformation of warfare from a contest between armed combatants to the wholesale destruction of human beings, regardless of their immediate combat capability, would haunt many participants for the remainder of their lives. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented a fundamental paradigm shift in the nature of naval warfare. Admiral Matome Ugaki, serving as Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, recorded in his personal diary that they had lost the ability to move freely within range of enemy land-based aircraft, and that the convoy system, which had formed the basis of their logistics operations since the war's beginning, was no longer operationally viable. Never again would the Japanese attempt to reinforce their garrison positions with large convoy operations conducted during daylight hours. From this point forward, only submarines and fast destroyer forces operating under cover of darkness, what became known as the rat runs, would be employed to supply isolated garrisons. The tactical success of skip bombing revolutionized Allied anti-shipping operations throughout the entire Pacific theater of operations. General Kenny's innovation, born from a combination of desperation and tactical necessity, had proven conclusively that properly equipped and trained land-based aircraft could control sea lanes as effectively as any naval surface force. Within months, skip bombing techniques were being employed from the Solomon Islands to the Philippines, making Japanese shipping movements increasingly hazardous and ultimately unsustainable over time. For Major Pappy Gunn, the architect of the B-25 gunship modifications, the battle represented both a professional triumph and a measure of personal vindication. His family remained imprisoned in the Philippines, and every Japanese ship sent to the bottom brought their eventual liberation incrementally closer. He continued his innovative work, developing new weapon systems and tactical concepts that would make Allied aircraft even more deadly in anti-shipping roles. North American Aviation, the manufacturer of the B-25 Mitchell, began incorporating Gunn's modifications directly into production aircraft, creating purpose-built gunships that would terrorize Japanese shipping for the war's duration. The strategic implications of the Bismarck Sea disaster created ripples throughout the entire Japanese command structure. On March 25, 1943, Imperial General Headquarters issued a new strategic directive prioritizing the defense of New Guinea over ongoing operations in the Solomon Islands. Without the capability to reinforce and supply their positions by sea transport, however, this directive was essentially meaningless in practical terms. The Japanese garrisons at Lae, Salamaua, and other positions distributed along the New Guinea coastline were now effectively isolated, left to fight and die in their current positions without hope of meaningful relief. Lieutenant General Adachi, who survived the sinking of Tokitsukaze against considerable odds, reached Lae with fewer than 1,200 troops, representing less than 20% of the force that had departed Rabaul with such high hopes. His 18th Army, already operating under strength and poorly supplied, would now be forced to confront growing Allied forces without any reasonable hope of significant reinforcement. In his first comprehensive report transmitted back to Rabaul, Adachi stated with brutal honesty that the situation had progressed beyond recovery by normal means. His pessimistic assessment would prove accurate. Within 6 months' time, Lae would fall to Allied forces advancing through combined land and air operations. The individual survival stories emerging from the battle proved both remarkable and deeply tragic in their details. Captain Tameichi Hara of destroyer Amatsukaze, which had not participated in the convoy operation, later conducted interviews with survivors and carefully recorded their experiences. One soldier from the 51st Division described spending 3 full days clinging to floating wreckage before finally washing ashore on a Japanese-held island. Of the 12 men who had initially started clinging to the same piece of debris, only 3 ultimately survived, the others claimed by sharks, physical exhaustion, or simple despair. Such accounts became increasingly common as survivors trickled in over the following weeks. Rear Admiral Kimura, wounded but surviving the battle, faced no official censure for the convoy's destruction. The Japanese High Command recognized that he had confronted an impossible tactical situation. He never commanded another convoy operation, however. The psychological impact of watching his entire force systematically destroyed within minutes by a form of attack he could neither anticipate nor effectively counter had broken something fundamental in this veteran officer. He spent the war's remainder in various administrative positions, haunted by memories of the Bismarck Sea. The American pilots who participated in the battle achieved instant legendary status throughout the Southwest Pacific Theater. Major Ed Larner received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership of the skip bombing attack. In private conversations, however, many expressed deep ambivalence regarding their victory. Lieutenant Charles Howe wrote to his wife that while they had destroyed the convoy completely and he understood the military necessity, he could not erase from his mind the sight of all those men struggling in the water, noting that this was not the kind of warfare he had imagined when he volunteered for service. General MacArthur, ever conscious of public relations and propaganda value, issued a triumphant communiqué claiming the destruction of 22 ships and 15,000 Japanese troops. These figures represented wild exaggerations of the actual results. Genuine Japanese losses amounted to 8 transport vessels, 4 destroyers, and approximately 3,000 personnel. The propaganda value proved immense regardless of accuracy. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was portrayed to the American public as revenge for Pearl Harbor, concrete proof that American innovation and courage could overcome Japanese military might. The reality, as always in warfare, proved considerably more complex and nuanced. For the Australians who participated in the engagement, particularly the Beaufighter crews of No. 30 Squadron, the victory validated their substantial contribution to the Pacific War effort. Often overshadowed in media coverage by their American allies, the RAAF's absolutely crucial role in suppressing Japanese anti-aircraft defenses had made the skip bombing attacks operationally feasible. Squadron leader Claude Ridley received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his leadership, but like his American counterparts, he expressed profound discomfort with the one-sided nature of the engagement. As he later reflected, it had not been a fight in any traditional sense, but rather an execution. The Japanese Army's response to the disaster centered on blaming the Navy for inadequate protection measures, rekindling the bitter inter-service rivalry that consistently hampered Japanese military effectiveness throughout the war's duration. Army commanders argued strenuously that the Navy should have provided aircraft carrier support for the convoy, conveniently ignoring the reality that Japan's carrier forces were already stretched to absolute breaking point across multiple theaters. The Navy countered that the Army's insistence on conducting daylight convoy operations in the face of overwhelming Allied air superiority constituted criminal negligence. This mutual recrimination and blame-shifting prevented any serious coordinated effort to develop effective counter-tactics against skip bombing. In the broader strategic context of the Pacific War, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked a turning point as historically significant as Midway or Guadalcanal. It demonstrated with absolute conclusiveness that air power, when properly employed with appropriate tactics and coordination, could control maritime lines of communication as effectively as any surface fleet. For island nations such as Japan and Britain that depended fundamentally on seaborne trade and supply logistics, this revolution in warfare methodology carried profound long-term implications. The age of the battleship as the dominant naval weapon system was ending. The age of the aircraft and air power had truly arrived. The technical lessons derived from the battle drove rapid innovation efforts on both sides of the conflict. The Allies continuously refined their skip bombing techniques, developing new specialized bomb sites and comprehensive training procedures that steadily increased accuracy rates even further. They also initiated experimentation with rockets and larger bomb sizes, seeking capability to destroy even the most heavily armored warships. The Japanese, belatedly recognizing the magnitude of the threat, attempted to develop various countermeasures, including barrage balloons, smokescreen generators, and specialized anti-aircraft ammunition specifically designed to engage low-flying aircraft. These defensive measures proved too little and arrived far too late to influence outcomes. Perhaps the most poignant element of the battle's aftermath involved the families of those killed. In Japan, where official casualty reports were heavily censored by government authorities, many families waited months or even years to learn the fate of their loved ones. A representative case involved Mrs. Yamada, whose husband had been aboard transport Teiyo Maru. She received only a brief official notice stating that he had died gloriously for the Emperor in the South Seas. She never learned specific details of his death, the terror of the skip bombing attack, the horror of the sinking ship, the desperate struggle in oil-covered waters. Such enforced ignorance was perhaps merciful given the horrific reality. For the Allied codebreakers, whose intelligence work had provided the critical information making the victory possible, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented tangible proof of their operational value. The capability to decrypt and read Japanese naval codes provided the Allies with an insurmountable intelligence advantage, allowing them to concentrate forces at precisely the right time and place for maximum effect. This success carried inherent danger, however. Should the Japanese realize their communications codes had been compromised, they would immediately change encryption systems, effectively blinding Allied intelligence operations. Extreme operational security measures were implemented to make the battle appear to result from fortunate reconnaissance rather than signals intelligence. The propaganda warfare following the battle proved almost as intense as the physical combat itself. Tokyo radio broadcast claims that the convoy had successfully delivered its troops to Leh with minimal losses, and that American victory claims represented laughable fabrications. The Japanese soldiers actually stationed at Leh understood the truth, however. They observed the pitiful remnants of what was supposed to represent their substantial relief force and comprehended that they were now truly isolated. Morale, already depressed from months of debilitating jungle warfare and chronically inadequate supplies, plummeted even further. In Washington and Canberra, the victory was seized upon enthusiastically as evidence that the strategic tide had definitively turned in the Pacific theatre. Political leaders who had previously expressed skepticism regarding MacArthur's ambitious plans for advancing through New Guinea now became believers and supporters. Resources that might otherwise have been allocated to other theatres of operation were redirected to the Southwest Pacific. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, in practical effect, validated MacArthur's overall strategy and ensured that the drive through New Guinea and subsequently the Philippines would receive the substantial support required for success. The environmental impact of the battle, though receiving little consideration at the time given more pressing concerns, proved quite significant. Thousands of tons of oil from the sunken vessels spread across vast expanses of the Bismarck Sea, fouling beaches and coral reefs for hundreds of miles in every direction. The wrecks themselves, heavily laden with ammunition and military supplies, became underwater tombs and long-term environmental hazards. These remain concerns even decades after the battle's conclusion. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea evolved into a classic case study examined in the evolution of modern warfare. It demonstrated with crystal clarity the paramount importance of tactical innovation, the critical value of intelligence operations, and the potentially decisive impact of air power when properly employed with appropriate doctrine. War colleges worldwide have analysed the battle extensively, drawing lessons about the vulnerability of surface ships to air attack, the absolute necessity of air superiority, and the critical importance of joint operations coordinating air and naval forces effectively. The personal courage displayed by individuals on both sides of the engagement deserves full recognition and respect. Japanese destroyer captains deliberately positioned their ships between transport vessels and attacking aircraft, fully aware they were likely accepting their own deaths. Allied pilots flew directly into walls of intense anti-aircraft fire at point-blank range, where any hit would prove instantly fatal. Sailors on both sides risked their lives repeatedly pulling survivors from oil-covered, shark-infested waters. Warfare inevitably brings out humanity's worst impulses, but occasionally also reveals the very best of human character under extreme duress. As the war progressed beyond the Bismarck Sea, veterans of that battle found themselves scattered across the vast Pacific theatre. Some participated in the subsequent island-hopping campaigns through the Solomon Islands and eventually the Philippines. Others were transferred to training commands, passing on the hard-earned tactical lessons of skip bombing to new generations of pilots entering combat. A few, psychologically burned out by the extreme intensity of combat operations, were sent home to recover, carrying physical and psychological scars that would never completely heal, regardless of time elapsed. General Kenny advanced to even greater prominence and responsibility, eventually commanding all Allied air forces throughout the Pacific region. He consistently regarded the Bismarck Sea as his greatest achievement, the battle that proved decisively that air power could be absolutely decisive in maritime warfare. In memoirs written years after the war's conclusion, he reflected that they had fundamentally changed the nature of warfare that day, proving that ships could no longer operate within range of land-based aircraft unless they controlled the airspace above them. It represented a lesson written in blood, he acknowledged, but one that absolutely needed to be learned and internalized. For Japan, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea constituted a strategic disaster from which they never achieved full recovery. The loss of an entire division's worth of troops and equipment, combined with the severe psychological impact of such a comprehensive defeat, marked the beginning of the end for Japanese positions throughout New Guinea. Within 1 year's time, most of their garrisons had been either destroyed through combat or isolated and effectively neutralized, left to slowly starve in the jungle as the war's main effort passed them by completely. The ambitious dream of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere effectively died in the oil-slicked waters of the Bismarck Sea. The technological revolution initiated by skip bombing continued evolving long after the war's conclusion. Modern anti-ship missiles essentially follow identical principles, employing high-speed, low-altitude approaches specifically designed to avoid detection and evade defensive systems. The B-25s of 1943, with their improvised gunship modifications and pioneering skip bombing techniques, represent the direct evolutionary ancestors of today's sophisticated maritime strike aircraft. The fundamental lesson that innovation and adaptation can overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges remains equally relevant today as it proved in the desperate circumstances of 1943. Ultimately, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea is remembered quite differently depending on perspective and nationality. For the Allies, it represents a triumph of innovation combined with courage, tangible proof that they possessed the capability to defeat Japan's finest forces. For the Japanese, it stands as tragedy, exemplifying the impossible strategic situation they confronted, outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an adversary whose technological and industrial superiority grew progressively stronger with each passing month. For the families of those killed on both sides, it simply marks a date when their world changed forever and irrevocably, when fathers, husbands, and sons vanished into the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, never to return. Today, the Bismarck Sea lies peaceful, its waters plied by fishing boats and occasional research vessels documenting the historical wrecks resting below. For those who understand the history, however, who comprehend what transpired in these waters on March 3, 1943, the sea tells a profoundly different story. These waters speak of innovation born from desperate necessity, of courage confronting certain death, of the terrible arithmetic of warfare, where success is coldly measured in ships destroyed and lives extinguished. They remind us that behind every military innovation, every tactical triumph, every strategic victory, there exists a human cost that can never be fully calculated, comprehended, or adequately repaid. The battle's enduring legacy extends well beyond pure military history into the complex realm of ethics and international law. The deliberate targeting of survivors struggling in the water, even when militarily justifiable to prevent them from reaching shore and reinforcing enemy positions, raises profoundly uncomfortable questions about the proper conduct of warfare. Where precisely does the line exist between military necessity and basic humanity? Can military actions be simultaneously tactically correct yet morally wrong? These difficult questions, first raised prominently in the Bismarck Sea's immediate aftermath, continue challenging military leaders, ethicists, and legal scholars today. For the survivors on both sides, the battle never truly ended in any psychological sense. Decades after the war's conclusion, elderly Japanese veterans still experienced nightmares featuring skip-bombing B-25s approaching at wave-top height. American pilots continued seeing faces of Japanese sailors struggling in the water, perpetually wondering whether they could have or should have acted differently. Australian Beaufighter crews still heard in their minds the distinctive sound of their cannons tearing through thin steel plating and human flesh. These invisible psychological wounds, no less real for being unseen, perhaps constitute the battle's most enduring and tragic legacy. The strategic impact of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea reverberated throughout the Pacific War's remaining duration. Japanese inability to effectively reinforce their isolated garrisons meant that Allied forces could advance more rapidly than initial planning had anticipated, leaping from island to island while bypassing strong points that would have otherwise required costly frontal assaults. Lives were saved, Allied lives specifically, as a direct consequence of the success at Bismarck Sea. This calculus of modern warfare, consciously trading Japanese lives for Allied ones, carries its own form of moral burden and ethical complexity that participants grappled with long after guns fell silent. In military academies worldwide, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea is studied extensively as a textbook example of what contemporary military theorists classify as effects-based operations, achieving strategic objectives through precise, focused application of force rather than overwhelming mass and attrition. The battle demonstrates compellingly that with proper intelligence preparation, innovative tactical concepts, and coordinated execution across services, a numerically smaller force can decisively defeat a larger adversary. This lesson resonates powerfully in a contemporary era characterized by precision weapons systems and constrained military budgets. The environmental legacy of the battle continues unfolding even today. The deteriorating wrecks slowly release oil and various other pollutants into the fragile marine ecosystem. Unexploded ordnance scattered across the sea floor poses ongoing risks to local fishermen and recreational divers. Efforts to properly document and preserve these sites as protected war graves face persistent challenges from illegal salvage operations seeking valuable scrap metals. The battle, in a very real sense, continues claiming new victims long after the last veteran participant has passed away. Cultural memory and commemoration of the battle varies dramatically between participating nations. In Australia, it is celebrated as a defining moment when the RAAF proved itself operationally equal to any air force worldwide. In the United States, it often finds itself overshadowed in popular consciousness by larger, more famous engagements such as Midway or the Philippine Sea battles. In Japan, it remains largely forgotten by the general public, simply one disaster among countless others in a catastrophic war that ultimately ended in atomic fire and unconditional surrender. These divergent national narratives reflect broader fundamental differences in how nations construct, remember, and interpret their respective military histories. The absolutely critical role of intelligence in achieving victory cannot possibly be overstated. The ultra-codebreakers who painstakingly decrypted Japanese communications, the coast watchers who risked their lives reporting ship movements from behind enemy lines, the reconnaissance pilots who located and tracked the convoy through dangerous skies, all played indispensable roles in the ultimate outcome. The battle demonstrates beyond any doubt that in modern industrialized warfare, accurate and timely information constitutes just as important a factor as raw firepower. Understanding precisely where the enemy is positioned, where they intend to move, and what they plan to accomplish provides an operational advantage that no quantity of courage or tactical skill alone can overcome or compensate for. The human dimension of the battle necessarily extends beyond the immediate combatants to include the indigenous peoples of New Guinea and surrounding islands. For these populations, the battle brought both unexpected opportunity and profound tragedy. Opportunity materialized in the form of valuable salvage from wrecked ships and aircraft that washed ashore. Tragedy came through the comprehensive disruption of their traditional fishing grounds and the violent introduction of industrialized modern warfare's devastation directly into their ancestral homeland. Their stories, largely unrecorded in official histories, nonetheless form an integral part of the battle's broader legacy and long-term impact on the region. Reflecting on the Battle of the Bismarck Sea from our current perspective spanning 8 decades, certain fundamental lessons emerge with clarity. Perhaps the most significant is the recognition that innovation in warfare, while absolutely necessary for achieving victory, invariably exacts a terrible human cost. The skip bombing technique that proved so devastatingly effective represented essentially a methodology for killing enemy personnel more efficiently. The modified B-25 gunships that swept through the helpless Japanese convoy were instruments of mass destruction, regardless of how much we might admire the mechanical ingenuity and creative thinking involved in their conception and development. Yet we must simultaneously acknowledge the broader historical context within which these innovations occurred and were employed. The Allied forces were actively fighting against an aggressive totalitarian regime that had launched unprovoked warfare across the entire Pacific region. The Japanese soldiers being transported to reinforce New Guinea were not innocent civilians, but trained military personnel, instruments of conquest and systematic oppression. The moral clarity that characterized the Second World War, so frequently absent in subsequent conflicts, provides at least some measure of justification for the terrible efficiency demonstrated in the Bismarck Sea victory. The battle also demonstrates with exceptional clarity the paramount importance of rapid adaptation in warfare. Both combatant sides entered the Pacific War carrying deeply ingrained preconceived notions about how naval warfare would be conducted, envisioning climactic gun duels between massive battleship fleets with aircraft relegated to supporting reconnaissance roles. The operational reality proved dramatically different from these expectations. Those military forces that adapted quickly to changing circumstances, exemplified by Kenny and his innovative airmen, achieved success. Those who stubbornly clung to outdated doctrine, like the Japanese convoy commanders who believed their destroyer escorts could adequately protect transport ships from determined air attack, paid a catastrophic price for their inflexibility. Looking toward the future, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea offers important cautionary warnings for contemporary military planners and strategists. It illustrates how rapidly technological advantage can shift between adversaries, and how quickly tactical innovations can render entire military strategies and force structures obsolete virtually overnight. In our current age, characterized by cyber warfare, unmanned aerial vehicles, and artificial intelligence applications, the core lesson of Bismarck Sea regarding the absolute necessity of continuous innovation and adaptation for military success remains profoundly relevant and applicable. The intensely personal stories emerging from the battle serve as powerful reminders that warfare ultimately concerns human beings, not abstract statistics or strategic calculations. Each of the approximately 3,000 Japanese personnel who perished in the Bismarck Sea possessed a family who loved them, personal hopes and dreams for the future, individual fears and aspirations. Each Allied airman who deliberately flew into walls of anti-aircraft fire had people anxiously waiting for them to return home safely. These individual tragedies, multiplied millions of times across the entirety of the Pacific War, constitute the true incalculable cost of armed conflict between nations. As the final living veterans of the battle pass away with advancing age, taking with them their irreplaceable first-hand memories and personal testimonies, we find ourselves left primarily with historical records, fading photographs, and scholarly interpretations. The genuine danger exists that the Battle of the Bismarck Sea becomes reduced to merely another historical event in textbooks, stripped entirely of its vital human dimension, reduced to impersonal arrows traced on strategic maps and cold statistics in academic references. We must actively resist this dehumanizing tendency, constantly remembering that history is ultimately made by individual human beings making difficult choices under extreme pressure, frequently working with incomplete information and facing agonizing moral dilemmas with no clear right answers. The battle's substantial influence on post-war military development and doctrine proved considerable and long-lasting. The dramatic success of skip bombing led directly to massively increased investment in specialized maritime strike aircraft and sophisticated anti-ship weapon systems. The demonstrated vulnerability of surface ships to coordinated air attack drove intensive development of improved anti-aircraft defense systems, radar technologies, and eventually surface-to-air guided missiles. The ongoing arms race between offensive air power capabilities and defensive naval protection systems, effectively initiated at Bismarck Sea, continues actively to the present day. For the nations involved, the battle became permanently embedded in their institutional military traditions and collective memories. The United States Air Force consistently cites Bismarck Sea as historical validation of independent air operations and strategic air power theory. The Royal Australian Air Force regards it as definitive proof of their combat effectiveness in complex joint operations. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force studies it extensively as a cautionary tale illustrating the extreme vulnerability of naval forces attempting to operate without achieving air superiority. These divergent interpretations and lessons learned continue actively shaping how modern military services prepare for potential future conflicts. The profound ethical questions raised by the battle's conduct continue resonating in contemporary military ethics discourse. The deliberate killing of survivors struggling helplessly in the water, even when arguably militarily justified to prevent them from reaching shore and subsequently reinforcing enemy positions, fundamentally challenges our civilized notions of honorable warfare and treatment of defeated enemies. The systematic targeting of transport ships densely packed with soldiers significantly blurs traditional distinctions between legitimate military combatants and non-combatants. These moral ambiguities and ethical dilemmas, first directly confronted in Bismarck Sea's immediate aftermath, remain intensely relevant today as military technology grows ever more lethal, precise, and discriminating in its effects. In the sweeping broader narrative of the Pacific War's progression, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea unquestionably represents a crucial strategic turning point. It marked the definitive moment when Allied forces irreversibly seized operational initiative throughout the Southwest Pacific region, when Japanese territorial expansion was not merely halted but dramatically reversed. The severe psychological impact, demonstrating conclusively that Japanese forces could be not just tactically defeated but operationally annihilated, substantially boosted Allied morale across all services while simultaneously devastating Japanese confidence at all command levels. Following Bismarck Sea, the fundamental question facing military planners was no longer whether Japan would ultimately lose the war, but rather how long the conflict would continue and at what final cost in lives and resources. The battle also exemplifies with exceptional clarity the critical importance of effective joint operations in modern industrialized warfare. The remarkable success achieved at Bismarck Sea required unprecedented levels of coordination between American and Australian forces, between air and naval operational units, between intelligence collection organizations and tactical commanders executing missions. This complex integration, extraordinarily difficult to achieve even during peacetime conditions, proved absolutely essential for victory. The lessons derived from the Battle of the Bismarck Sea retain significant relevance for contemporary military planning. The absolutely critical nature of air superiority in modern warfare, the extreme vulnerability of surface naval vessels to air attack when lacking adequate defensive measures, the decisive impact of tactical surprise and innovative employment of forces. These lessons, learned at such terrible cost in 1943, remain fundamentally applicable for military planners and strategists today. The remarkable human capacity for both creative destruction and determined survival displayed at Bismarck Sea deserves recognition. The ingenuity and innovation that created skip bombing techniques and gunship-configured B-25s demonstrates human creativity directed toward warfare. The extraordinary courage of pilots deliberately flying into intense anti-aircraft fire and sailors repeatedly risking their lives rescuing survivors from burning, oil-covered waters demonstrates human bravery and compassion under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The terrible suffering of those who died trapped in burning ships or struggling in oil-covered waters provides stark reminder of warfare's ultimately tragic cost. As we conclude this comprehensive examination of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, we must fully acknowledge its profound complexity and contradictions. It simultaneously represents a tactical triumph and a human tragedy of immense proportions, a stunning display of military innovation and a horrifying example of industrial-scale destruction, a necessary military action and an enduring moral challenge. These inherent contradictions are hardly unique to Bismarck Sea, but rather characterize all warfare throughout human history. They appear particularly stark and undeniable in this specific battle where tactical success proved so overwhelmingly complete, yet the visible human cost remained so horrifyingly apparent. The enduring legacy of those few brief moments, the handful of seconds Japanese destroyer captains possessed to react to the revolutionary skip bombing attack employing 5-second delay fuses, extends far beyond the immediate tactical situation. In those compressed few seconds, the fundamental nature of naval warfare changed forever and irreversibly. The historical era when surface warships could operate with relative impunity within range of hostile shores definitively ended. The absolute dominance of air power over traditional sea power was established beyond any reasonable doubt. The critical importance of continuous innovation and rapid adaptation in warfare was demonstrated with devastating clarity. Today, as international tensions rise ominously in the same Pacific waters where the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was fought 8 decades ago, the hard-learned lessons of March 1943 remain intensely relevant and applicable. The paramount importance of air superiority, the severe vulnerability of naval forces to precision weapons, the critical role of intelligence and comprehensive surveillance. All these factors, so dramatically demonstrated at Bismarck Sea, continue actively shaping contemporary military planning and operational concepts. The ghosts of the Bismarck Sea still have important lessons to teach us, provided we remain willing to learn from their tragic sacrifice. In remembering and commemorating the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, we honour not exclusively the victors, but rather all participants regardless of nationality. We recognise their extraordinary courage, mourn their grievous losses, and strive to learn from their experiences, both positive and negative. The battle stands as a powerful reminder that warfare, however necessary it may sometimes appear in specific historical circumstances, invariably represents human tragedy on a massive scale. The innovation and courage displayed at Bismarck Sea unquestionably deserve our admiration and respect, but the death and widespread destruction should simultaneously strengthen our collective resolve to discover better methods for resolving international conflicts without resorting to mass violence. The comprehensive story of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, from Rear Admiral Kimura's desperate convoy mission to General Kenny's revolutionary innovative tactics, from the personal courage of individual pilots and sailors to the overwhelming tragedy of thousands of unnecessary deaths, is ultimately and fundamentally a profoundly human story. It reminds us forcefully that behind every military innovation, every tactical victory, every strategic decision with far-reaching consequences, there exist real human beings whose lives are forever and irrevocably changed by the experience. In those few compressed seconds that Japanese captains possessed to react to the unexpected threat, in those 15 catastrophic minutes that utterly destroyed an entire military convoy, whole worlds ended abruptly and the course of history pivoted dramatically. This constitutes the truest and most enduring legacy of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Not merely the tactical lessons or strategic implications for military professionals, but rather the stark reminder that warfare represents the most serious of all human endeavours, simultaneously demanding our finest qualities of courage and innovation while revealing our terrible capacity for organised destruction. As we collectively face an uncertain future filled with potential conflicts, the battle's profound lessons about innovation, adaptation, and the ultimately tragic human cost of warfare remain equally relevant today, as they proved on that clear tropical morning in March 1943, when skip-bombing B-25 Mitchell bombers approached at wave-top height and fundamentally changed the nature of warfare forever. The men who fought courageously and died in the Bismarck Sea, whether Japanese or Allied, whether soldiers, sailors, or airmen, deserve to be remembered not as impersonal statistics in history books, but as individual human beings who found themselves at a crucial pivot point in history. Their sacrifice, whether voluntary or compelled, whether achieved in victory or suffered in defeat, contributed substantially to shaping our modern world. We owe them not merely respectful remembrance, but genuine understanding and the solemn obligation to learn from their experiences to build a better, more peaceful future for coming generations. As the sun sets peacefully over the Bismarck Sea today, its waters calm and serene, it requires considerable imagination to envision the violence and terror of March 3, 1943. Beneath those deceptively peaceful waters lie the physical remains of ships and men, serving as silent testimony to one of the Pacific War's most decisive and historically significant battles. Their continuing presence reminds us that the freedom and prosperity we enjoy today was purchased at terrible cost, and that we bear a solemn obligation to those who paid that ultimate price to use our inherited freedom wisely and work tirelessly toward creating a world where such terrible sacrifices are no longer necessary. This is the complete story of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, a complex narrative encompassing innovation and destruction, courage and terror, victory and tragedy. It deserves to be told and retold, not because warfare deserves glorification, but because understanding our past in all its complexity and inherent contradictions proves essential to successfully navigating our future. The mere handful of seconds that Japanese destroyer captains possessed to react to the revolutionary skip-bombing assault might seem like a trivial detail in the vast sweeping narrative of World War II. Yet in those few compressed seconds, the future direction of the Pacific War was determined, and thousands of individual human lives were sealed to their fate, for better or worse, in ways that continue echoing through history to the present day.